To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
Well, hello and welcome to this special edition of Islands at War. We're going to be taking a look at some Commando raids which took place 82 years ago today at the time of recording. I'm recording this on Boxing Day 2025. So the two raids were Operation Hardtack 7 and Operation Hardtack 28. We'll deal with Hardtack 28 first because that one went ahead as planned on the night of Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Hardtack 7 was also supposed to take place at the same timings, but they hit a few hitches, so the raid had to be delayed slightly. So we'll touch on that one as we go on, and you can find out why one raid took place slightly later than the other. Dealing with Operation Hardtack 28 first, that took place on Christmas Day 1943, so 82 years ago today. Captain P. Ayton, Lieutenant L. Hulo, Sergeant D. Roberts, Corporal J. I think that is, I apologise if I've mispronounced that, Corporal M. Rue, and Corporal Allen undertook the only Allied raid on Jersey during the Second World War, which was Operation Hardtack 28. They had a very simple plan, much like the other hardtack operations. It was to land and gather intelligence and capture and bring home a German soldier for interrogation, not too dissimilar to that of Operation Battle, which had taken place in the Channel Islands on Sark the previous year. Captain Ayton had not been detailed to lead this raid originally. It was another officer who'd been married with a family, and Captain Ayton had just returned from leave, so he actually volunteered to take that officer's place so that he could spend Christmas with his family. Hardtack itself, you obviously gather from the fact that I'm talking about Operation Hardtack 7 and Operation Hardtack 28 that there were a whole series of Allied commando raids during the Second World War, mostly conducted by Number 10 Inter-Allied Commando and Number 12 Commando and the Special Boats Service. They all took place on German-occupied territory in the Channel Islands and on the nearby French coast. Most of the raids consisted of 10-man teams, although they did vary from time to time. They were of various ranks, and as you'll have gathered from some of the names that I've already mentioned, and the fact that it's Inter-Allied Commando, these were made up of multiple nationalities, not just British forces. So there were, in fact, on these raids, a number of French commandos as well. They were delivered to the scenes of the landings by MGBs and then subsequently landed on the beaches using small boats known as dories, except for one of the hardtack operations, which was an airborne landing, but we're not dealing with that one today. In the case of Operation Hardtack 28, which took place on the night of Christmas Day and Boxing Day, 6 men, 1 British officer, which was Ayton, 1 French officer, which was Hulot, and 4 other ranks made up the raiding party. They had planned to land at Giffard Bay on Jersey's north coast, but they changed the landing location a few days before and moved it to Petit Port. This was possibly related to the fact that RAF reconnaissance flights spotted a heavy German defence above Giffard Bay, and they were worried that their raid would be compromised before it even got going. The Navy boats that were used for the raid were codenamed Force 113, and the particular boat that the commandos went on was MGB 329. Like many of the commando raids on the Channel Islands, they actually left from Dartmouth, and the naval boats took up position once they reached Jersey, about half a mile off the coast, which was fairly standard for these sorts of raids. The team disembarked and used a small boat to reach the shore. Now, one thing that many people don't appreciate was obviously that there was no sophisticated way of communicating during these things, so they could only use torchlight, no radios, no walkie-talkies, none of this fancy fancy stuff or none of the modern technology that we obviously have these days. But they managed to land without being spotted. So the only way they could attract the attention of the boats, if they needed to, was to use torchlight. Once they'd landed on the beach of Petit Port, they left one member of the team there to look after the boat that they'd left there and make sure it remained concealed and look out for any Germans that might be searching for them. The rest of the team, so that's 5 men, went up the beach and up the hillside. They found a building which is known as the Wolf's Lair, which was basically a corrugated iron shack for storage attached to it as well. They had a good search round, couldn't find anybody there, and so they decided that they were going to move on. They couldn't find any signs of enemy activity, which they thought was a little bit odd, given that there were about 10,000 Germans on the island, or so the intelligence that they had told them. Continuing up until they reached a wire obstacle further up the valley. It was about 3 feet high and ran for about 200 yards. They discovered the first evidence of the German occupation. They noticed that there were some signs next to the barbed wire which said, much like Guernsey, Sark and Albany, the Germans had laid massive amounts of mines around the islands. If you take Guernsey, there were about 65,000. In Jersey, it said that there were around 95,000 mines. So all around the coast, making it very, very hazardous to conduct this sort of operation. Having managed to negotiate the minefield, they came to the hamlet of Egypt, where they visited a house. They found that all of the windows were broken and there were no signs of recent use. Now, this is not unusual because by this stage of the war, the Germans had moved a lot of people away from the coast. They didn't want people to be able to give assistance to any commandos that might be raiding or any other forces that might try and take the entire island back, let alone conduct a raid. So it was not unusual to find buildings abandoned. In Guernsey, they destroyed approximately 200 buildings around the coast, purely to avoid any commando raids taking place and being able to use them as shelter or positions from which to fire on German troops. Whilst they were looking around this abandoned building, they found a sign which said, "Military zone, entry to civilians strictly forbidden," both in German and in English, which was, again, a very common feature. There were a large amount of coastal areas which were prohibited to the populations of all of the islands. Indeed, in Sark, the civilian population had predominantly been moved to the centre of the island, along with the Germans during night time, as they were concerned about such raids as this one on Jersey. Carrying on further inland, they found a bunker which is known as the M5 Army Observation Bunker, and we were slightly surprised to find that it was completely abandoned. They had a good look around. There was no enemy presence observed, and they entered the bunker to find it was locked and abandoned. They also found a pillbox and some slit trenches, which also showed no signs of recent use. So by this stage, they're slightly despairing at the fact that they probably aren't going to find any Germans during the course of the raid. This caused a fair bit of confusion about the lack of any resistance whatsoever yet, or any sign of recent activity in this coastal area. Having decided that the best way that they might encounter some Germans, maybe an enemy patrol, was to proceed inland, where they went to a farmhouse which looked to be lived in. So they advanced and knocked on the door. They waited approximately a quarter of an hour when a frightened woman opened the window on the first floor, and in English they asked her if she could tell them the whereabouts of the Germans. Now she was thinking, hang on a minute, these are Germans trying to trick me. I'll be getting into trouble if I assist them. They're testing me to see if I will help enemy troops. So she told them basically that they should go away. The commandos had not actually realised that where they were was really just a training area for the Germans and was not actively manned during the course of 1943. So the woman eventually got her message across by using her best German swear words and told them basically they were unwelcome. It was abundantly clear from this that she was unclear that these were in fact German and French commandos. Otherwise, she would have been far more welcoming of them. Proceeding further on, They had a little bit more luck when they met the Le Breton brothers. They knocked on the front door of their house, and Hedley Le Breton came to the door and opened it. But he was so frightened he couldn't speak. You know, you can imagine seeing these guys at the door. You've no idea what British forces look like. They've got blackened faces. They're carrying machine guns. They're going to be quite intimidating. You've got no real lights in your house. They're best relying on candles at this time of night. Fortunately for him, his brother John soon came to the door, who was also very frightened, but they managed to calm him down enough so that they could speak in both French and English. Once they'd relaxed, because again, they thought this might be a German trap, they agreed to give an interview and gave the commandos some meal. So this provided some useful information for the raiders, at least having not been able to capture anybody from the German forces at this point. Now, the Le Breton brothers were farmers, and they were very helpful in guiding the team across the fields and back towards where they needed to be. Captain Ayton and Holt then went on alone and arrived at what was thought to be a minefield. Ayton investigated further and found a single wire antenna sticking out of the ground, and further ones at intervals about a yard in staggered rows were found. Now, these sorts of mines with these antennas were the S mines, or bouncing betties as they were known. These are canisters which basically, when triggered, would jump up out of the ground to a height about waist height when they would explode. Now, these were packed with hundreds of ball bearings, which, as you can imagine, if it goes off at waist height, is not going to end well for you. Having negotiated past this minefield, they realised they only had 45 minutes to make it back to the beach before the naval force would leave. So they decided to return by the way they had come, avoiding the actual path for fear of mines, and just giving up on the whole idea of grabbing a prisoner, because there just weren't any Germans around for them to find. Having reached Petit Port, they discovered that the boat was not there and moved northward along the cliff to look for it, flashing a torch for about 15 minutes to try and attract the attention of the dory. They came across a cattle fence which extended down the cliff, and they crawled under the fence. And at this point, when Ayton was crawling under the fence, there was a vivid red flash which lit up the whole area and a loud explosion. At first, they thought a German patrol had found them and proceeded cautiously forward, but saw no one and soon realised that Captain Ayton had trodden on a mine. At first, the commandos could not find him and searched the cliffside. Eventually, they heard a faint cry for help and found him lying badly wounded on the cliffside with his foot entangled in some brambles, which frankly was the least of his problems, but it had at least stopped him from falling down the cliffs. Having no time to investigate further the minefield and worried about the chances that an enemy patrol would come to investigate the explosion, they decided to recover one fragment of the mine and brought it back. Having finally managed to attract the attention of the MGB using their torches, it sent a dory back to collect them. After much difficulty, they managed to get Captain Ayton down the cliff and finally re-embarked at 0520 hours on Boxing Day. Although they'd still been on land for half an hour after the explosion, approximately, there was no reaction to what the explosion that had been triggered when Captain Ayton stood on the mine, although sadly Ayton died later on that day. So having volunteered to take the place of another officer, he was sadly to lose his life. The raid was marked as a success, despite the fact that they hadn't been able to capture any Germans. They had gathered valuable samples of barbed wire and important intelligence on the strength of the enemy forces, and a detailed interview with the Le Breton brothers. This was all, of course, with a view to if they had to take back the Channel Islands by force, which we will touch on in other episodes later on in the series. There were very serious plans, both before and after this, to try and attempt to take back the islands. Now, heading off to Operation Hardtack 7, I'll put some pictures and links for all of these raids to my website and to other websites which have some photographs which will help you understand what went on. Hardtack 7 had been due to take place at the same time as Hardtack 28 on the night of the 25th, 26th of December. Unfortunately, when they reached Sark for Hardtack 7, they went to Terrible Point. If you've ever been to Sark and are familiar with this is a very difficult cliff to climb, and it also has a bit of a gap towards the land from the rocks that they were attempting to climb up, and they just simply couldn't make it across. So they had to abandon taking part in the raid on that night. So they returned back to Dartmouth. This was partly to prove to be their undoing when it came. The reason for this was when they returned on the night of the 27th, 28th of December, they decided to take the same route up the Hog's Back as had been taken by the team on Operation Basalt. I've got a detailed article about Basalt. We also talked about Basalt in an earlier episode, which I'll put in the show notes. Or if you go to the website, you can search for it there. Now, of course, Basalt is the famous raid on Sark, and hardly anybody really knows about Hardtack 7. Again, this was number 10 Inter-Allied Commando taking part in this raid, so made up of French and British personnel. Unfortunately, as the route had been used previously during Operation Basalt, the Hardtack 7 team, having got to the top of the Hog's Back on the coast of Sark, found that minefields had been laid by the Germans and several mines were detonated, causing a number of casualties. After this, they just decided that the best option, having only made it about 50 yards along the Hog's Back, was simply to return back to the vessel on which they'd arrived. During the course of the return to the boat, more mines were set off, and in the after-action report, it was noted that these mines didn't seem to impact anybody who was laying down. However, those who were kneeling or standing up were severely injured or indeed killed. This is again the same sort of mine which had been used along the headline. This was the same sort of mine that had been encountered by the Hardtack 28 team in Jersey. So sadly, as a result of the raid, there were a number of deaths of men that were killed on the raid, being Corporal Dignac and Corporal R. Bellamy, which was 2 men out of the 7 that took part in the raid. This raid was, in fact, a complete failure. The Germans obviously seized on this, and German news agencies reported the attempt by the British commandos to land on the island of Sark, and that it had failed. It was perhaps the most accurate report of a raid on the Channel Islands by the Germans. There were a number of other hardtack raids on the Channel Islands, and we'll deal with those in another episode. As I mentioned earlier, if you go and take a look at the links on the show notes, that will guide you to various articles and photographs that you can see, which will help you to understand these raids. I hope you think this has been an interesting look at those raids. Coming up in next week's episode, we have a special with Dave Hewitt, a listener to the show, but also someone who's spent quite a lot of time studying the occupation of the Channel Islands. And I was very pleased to have a quick chat with him when he was briefly in the island. We had a really good chat about a number of aspects of the occupation and his particular interest of it, which will be out in the next episode. So I hope you've all had a good Christmas. Keith and I will be back as normal in the new year with November 1943. Cheers.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone.